Ruthless Korean Mafia Boss was a ghost in his own penthouse, until a black janitor broke his silence. ONETHE penthouse of silence. The penthouse was 63 floors above Seoul and felt like the inside of a cloud, silent, suspended, untouchable. Every wall that could be glass was glass, and the city spread below in every direction like a circuit board lit in amber and white, vast and indifferent and endlessly in motion. It was the kind of view that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime, and Park Joon-ho had not looked at it in 4 months. He sat in the same chair he sat in every night, a single leather piece positioned at the center of the living room with its back to the windows, facing nothing in particular. A glass of scotch in his right hand, not quite to his lips. His left hand open on the armrest, perfectly still. He was 53 years old, and he looked like a man who had been powerful for so long he had forgotten what the feeling meant from the inside. At 11:47, he heard the elevator. The cleaning staff came Tuesdays and Fridays. This was a Monday. He did not move. He heard the doors part, the heavy drag of a wheeled cart across marble, the deliberate, unhurried footsteps of a man who was not in a hurry. His security had cleared the building at 10. Whoever was on his floor had already passed 3 levels of screening. He raised the glass and took a slow sip. The man who entered the living room was black, tall, somewhere between 40 and 45, with the kind of stillness in his bearing that registered immediately as unusual. He wore the gray uniform of the building's contracted cleaning service. He pushed the cart to the center of the room and stopped. He looked at Joon-ho with the polite, direct acknowledgement of a man entering a workspace, not a throne room, not a crime scene, a workspace. "Good evening," he said. His Korean was precise, unaccented in the way that suggested deliberate study rather than absorption. "I've been reassigned to the upper floors this week. I'll start in the kitchen if you prefer." Joon-ho looked at him. In 6 years of owning this penthouse, no cleaning staff member had spoken to him. They worked in silence around him as though he were a piece of furniture too valuable to disturb. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. He said nothing. The man waited a moment, then nodded once, the professional acknowledgement of a non-answer, and moved toward the kitchen. Joon-ho heard water running, surfaces wiped, the methodical sequence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was doing it without performance. At 12:19, the man reappeared in the living room and moved to the bookshelves along the east wall, working left to right. "Those do not need cleaning," Joon-ho said. The man turned. "They have dust on the spines," he said without apology. "The books haven't been touched in a while." He said it as a statement of observable fact, the way a doctor reads a chart. Then he turned back to the shelf and continued. Joon-ho put down his glass. He studied the man's back. In 40 years of building an empire on the precise calculation of fear and ambition, he had developed an instinct for the specific quality of a person's nerve. This man had no aggression, but he had no deference either. He simply had presence. The rarest thing Joon-ho had encountered in a very long time. The cleaning took 40 minutes. At the end, the man collected his cart, nodded to Joon-ho across the room, and said, "Same time Friday." Not a question. He left. The elevator doors closed. Joon-ho sat in the silence that followed. It was the same silence that had occupied this penthouse for 4 months, but it felt, in some small and inexplicable way, different. Less total. Chapter TWOTHE man who disappeared Friday, he came back. On the following Monday, he came again. Joon-ho had not adjusted the schedule with building management. He told himself this was because it was a minor administrative detail. He told himself this for approximately 4 days before acknowledging, in the private chamber of his own skull, that it was not true. The man's name, according to the building service contractor, was Solomon Ademi. 11 months with the firm. No anomalies in his file. Security clearances for upper floor access confirmed and current. He was, by every formal metric, exactly what he appeared to be. He was also the only person in 6 years who had spoken to Joon-ho inside this apartment as though he were a person, rather than a condition to be managed. On the 3rd visit, Joon-ho said, "You studied law." Solomon paused. He turned, expression unchanged. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move through a room," Joon-ho said. "You assess before you act. You document as you work. And when I told you the shelves didn't need cleaning, you identified a factual counterargument before proceeding. These are not the habits of a man who spent his life in service. A long pause. Solomon set down the spray bottle. He looked at Joon-ho with the kind of direct, unhurried attention most men reserved for people they respected, and extended without apparent calculation to this silent, difficult man in the leather chair. Constitutional law, he said. Howard University, 12 years, and before that, civil rights litigation in Washington. Joon-ho absorbed this without expression. And now you are here. And now I'm here, Solomon agreed. He said it without bitterness and without performance, a simple description of where a man's choices and the world's indifference had deposited him. He picked up the spray bottle and returned to work. Joon-ho said, most men in your position would be angry. Solomon wiped the glass of the display case. Most men in your position would have left this room at some point in the last 4 months. He said it without looking up, without cruelty. Simply another observable fact. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not avoidable either. Joon-ho set his glass down. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed orders ending careers, moving territories, building and dismantling the economic architecture of entire districts. How do you know I haven't left? Your staff leaves the same takeout containers 3 nights running before a new set arrives, Solomon said. The laundry schedule hasn't changed. And that chair, he glanced at the leather piece, has a wear pattern on the left armrest that suggests you've sat in it every night for a long time. He gathered his materials. You're not a ghost, Mr. Park. You're a man who's decided to stop being seen. Left. Joon-ho sat for a long time afterward in the chair with the worn armrest, watching the city move without him 63 floors below. Chapter THRETHE Weight of Glass. It was Solomon who changed the sequence. On his 7th visit, he did not go immediately to the kitchen. He stopped in the living room, looked at Joon-ho in the chair, and said, "Do you want to tell me about her?" The room went very still. Joon-ho said, "I don't know what you mean." His voice was even, the voice of a man who had spent decades making sure no sentence he spoke contained an opening. Solomon looked at the single-framed photograph on the shelf at the far end of the room, the only personal object in the penthouse. A Korean woman in her late 40s, standing in a garden, laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph was not dusty. It was the only thing in the apartment that was. You haven't moved it, Solomon said, but you've been cleaning it yourself. It's the only surface in here that doesn't need me. Silence stretched. Joon-ho looked at the photograph for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was the same controlled instrument it always was, but beneath it, a subterranean pressure, the sound of a structure bearing more weight than it was designed for. Wife, Myrae, he paused. 7 years ago. An illness that was caught late and moved quickly. 4 months between the diagnosis and the end. He looked back at Solomon. She was the person who required me to exist in rooms with other people. Without her, I find that I do not particularly need to. Solomon sat down, not in the far chair, on the coffee table directly across from Joon-ho, which was not a thing a cleaning employee did in the penthouse of a Korean crime boss. He sat with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at Joon-ho without pity and without the careful professional distance everyone else maintained. "I know what that's like," he said. "Not grief exactly like yours, but I know what it is to build your entire architecture around one load-bearing structure and then have it removed, and then not know what to do with the walls you built around it." Joon-ho studied him. "The law career." Solomon nodded slowly. "I spent 12 years teaching constitutional law and 6 before that in federal litigation. I brought a corruption case against a senior official in the Department of Justice. The evidence was solid, the case was correct, and I lost everything for it: position, funding, colleagues, country. I came to Seoul because it was far enough, and no one here knew the name or what it used to mean." He said it cleanly, without self-pity. The way a man states the contents of a room he has already fully inventoried. "I'm genuinely unsure at this point whether I'm mourning a career or an identity. For a very long time the two were the same thing." Joon-ho looked at him. Something had shifted in the room, some invisible calibration of the space between them. "You should be teaching," he said. "Probably," Solomon agreed. "Then why aren't you?" Solomon was quiet for a moment. For the same reason you haven't left that chair in 4 months. Because the thing that made it feel worth doing is gone and I haven't yet found the thing that comes after. He looked at Joon-ho steadily. I think you haven't either. City moved 63 floors below them. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Myrae stood in her garden, frozen in a moment of laughter that had never stopped being true. Joon-ho said, sit somewhere with a back. That table is not comfortable. Solomon moved to the chair opposite. They sat together in the penthouse's vast silence, and for the first time in 7 years, the silence inside Joon-ho Park's chest was, very slightly, less. Chapter FOURWHAT. The glass hides. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, not Solomon's scheduled night. Joon-ho was in the chair. He was almost always in the chair. His phone lit up with a name he recognized as a signal. Not the man's real name, but the alias his security division head used when a situation had escalated past the level his subordinates could manage without his direct instruction. He answered with a single word, listened for 90 seconds, said 2 more words, set the phone face down on the armrest. A rival faction, testing the perimeter of his operations for 6 weeks, had made a move against his organization's charitable front in Mapogu. The community legal clinic he had funded anonymously for 11 years, providing free constitutional counsel to workers and tenants, had been vandalized. A warning. An attempt to reach him through the only thing that still connected him, however distantly, to Myrae's vision of what his empire could also mean. He did not call his security team back. He sat for a long moment, his hand flat on the armrest. Then he rose from the chair, the first time he had risen past midnight in 4 months, and walked to the window. He stood before the city with his hands behind his back and looked at it, not past it, at it. He heard the elevator at 2:47. He did not turn. This isn't your night, he said. Building reassigned my Tuesday slot, Solomon said. I traded for Thursday. He pushed the card in, then stopped. He looked at Joon-ho standing at the window, the specific way he was standing, the stillness that was not the stillness of a man at rest, but of a man holding something very heavy. What happened? A business matter. It's being handled. Solomon left the cart where it was. He walked to the window and stood beside him, not close, but close enough that his presence was deliberate. They both looked at the city. The clinic in Mapogu, Joon-ho said finally, not looking at him. Someone sent a message through it. He paused. Myrae believed that an organization with enough power to intimidate should also have enough power to protect. She spent 4 years convincing me to fund the clinic. She called it the point of the whole thing. He was quiet. I haven't been to it since she died. I have continued to fund it. I thought that was enough. Solomon was still beside him. It's not enough, he said. Joon-ho turned to look at him. Funding without presence is charity, Solomon said, not unkind. The voice of a man who had spent 12 years teaching people to argue correctly. Presence is protection. Myrae knew the difference. That's why she asked you to be there, not just to write the check. He met Joon-ho's eyes. The people who sent that message tonight knew you, feel it, which means the clinic still matters to you, which means you still matter to it. He paused. You're not a ghost, Mr. Park. You're a man who hasn't decided yet whether he wants to be alive. The city spread below them in all its indifferent, brilliant motion. Joon-ho looked at it for a long time. His reflection in the glass, the ghost he had been for 7 years, looked back at him from the surface of the empire he had built, and was, for the first time, something he could not simply look past. The clinic will need legal counsel, he said. He said it to the glass, to the city, to the reflection. Its board has operated without a qualified advisor for 2 years. A constitutional law background would be significant overqualification for the role. The salary is modest. He felt Solomon go still beside him. Are you offering me a job? I am describing an opening, Joon-ho said. What you do with that information is your decision. City hummed 63 floors below. Solomon looked at his reflection beside Joon-ho's in the glass, 2 men, one visible and one self-erased, standing at last in the same window frame. I'll think about it, he said, which both of them in different ways already knew was yes. Chapter FIVETHE. City below. 6 months later, the penthouse smelled different. Cedar still. The bones of the place were unchanged, but also coffee, paper, and the particular dry warmth of a room where people thought. Books lay open on surfaces. The leather chair had been moved to face the window. Park Joon-ho sat in it now, not to avoid the city but to watch it. On the shelf at the far end of the room, Miray's photograph stood in its usual place. Beside it now, a second frame, a photograph taken at the reopening ceremony of the Mapo-gu clinic, 3 weeks after the vandalism. A Korean man in a dark coat standing beside a black man in a suit at the entrance of a modest, well-lit building. Both men looking not at the camera, but at something just past it. The image of two people who have found, if not destination, then direction. Solomon Adami had accepted the board council role. He had done so in the exact manner in which he did everything, without drama, by appearing at Joon-ho's door on a Tuesday evening in different clothes, a slim dark suit, a white shirt, no cleaning cart, and saying, "I'll need access to the clinic's existing case files before I can advise on structure." Joon-ho had provided the access. That was all that needed to be said. What followed was a reconstitution, not of Joon-ho's power, which had never diminished, but of his presence within it. He began attending the weekly operational briefings he had delegated for 7 years. He began responding to correspondence that did not require him to leave the building, and then correspondence that did. And then one ordinary Wednesday morning he walked into a boardroom in Gangnam-gu for the first time since Miray's death and sat at the head of the table and said, "Tell me where we are." His subordinates described the morning in different words but with the same essential structure. The boss was back. Not recovered, not repaired. Back with the specific gravity of a man who had been somewhere very dark and had chosen, deliberately, to return. Solomon's world was the clinic, the case files, the clients, the community board meetings on Thursday evenings in a fluorescent-lit room in Mapo-gu. He rebuilt his legal practice not as it had been, prestigious, institutional, operating at the level of federal power, but as it could be at ground level, where the law's protection was most needed and most absent. He was very good at it. He had always been very good at it. What had changed was that he no longer needed the institution to validate that knowledge. He carried it in himself. They met on Thursday evenings. Not always at the penthouse, sometimes at a restaurant in Yongsan that Solomon had found and Joon-ho had, after his initial refusal, agreed was correctly described as exceptional. Sometimes at the clinic after hours, where Joon-ho sat in a plastic chair with a takeout coffee and read Solomon's case summaries with the focused attention he brought to financial intelligence reports. He understood power. He was learning, slowly and with genuine effort, to understand justice. One evening in early winter they stood on the penthouse terrace. It was the first time Joon-ho had opened the terrace door in 7 years. The air was very cold and very clear, and the city below was a carpet of moving light that stretched to the edges of the sky. Their breath showed in white clouds. Solomon stood at the railing, hands in his coat pockets, looking out with the unhurried attention he brought to everything. Joon-ho stood beside him. He had spent 7 years looking at this city from behind glass. Filtered, contained at a precise and managed remove. The cold air was a different thing entirely. It carried the city's actual smell, exhaust and river and street food and winter, and it was insistent and alive in a way the penthouse's climate-controlled silence never was. "You should teach again," Joon-ho said. Solomon turned to look at him. "I do teach. Thursday evenings, constitutional rights training for clinic volunteers. You know what I mean." Solomon looked back at the city. "Maybe. A university in Seoul contacted me last month." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't answered yet." "Them," Joon-ho said. Solomon glanced at him. The small, precise expression Joon-ho had learned over 6 months of Thursday evenings to read as warmth. "You're remarkably directive for a man who spent 4 months not leaving a chair." "I learned it from someone," Joon-ho said. "Same time Friday was not a request." Solomon laughed, a real, full laugh that the cold air carried out over the city. Joon-ho did not laugh, but something in his face opened, very slightly, in the way of a man who has remembered, against all expectation, that laughter is a sound he does not need to be afraid of. Below them, Seoul moved in its endless, indifferent, brilliant motion. Above them, the winter sky was clear and full of its own cold light. On the shelf inside, Mireille laughed in her garden, frozen in a moment that had never stopped being true. Joon-ho Park put both hands on the railing. He looked at the city. Not past it, not through it, at it, as a man who was in it, who was part of it, who was still, against all probability, here. He stayed until the cold became too much. Then he went inside, left the terrace door slightly open and put the kettle on the end next.